Afternoon or good evening. I'm in Los Angeles. Wherever you are around the country, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Marty Kaplan, and this is Democracy in the Age of COVID-19. I'm the director of the Norman Lear Center, which is virtually housed in the Lear Center. That's it over my shoulder. And if it weren't current circumstances, I'd invite you all inside to the lovely living room there, and we'd be doing this together. But as it is, I think everybody is now accustomed to doing things on Zoom. So if you're watching there or watching on Facebook Live, welcome. The Norman Lear Center for 20 years at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism has been studying the difference that media makes. The core idea is that stories matter. Stories show us who we are, and they show us who we want to be. And storytellers matter because they have the power to do that. They have the power through telling their stories to affect what we know, what we believe, even how we behave. And we, the Lear Center, we're trying our best to help storytellers use their power responsibly. They do want to do that. They also want to make money. We don't think that there's necessarily a conflict between them. The area in which this has the highest stakes is public health. So for the past 20 years, the Lear Center has had a project called Hollywood Health and Society, in which we have worked with the writers and the networks in order to provide free services to them. We put them in touch, we put you writers in touch with experts for free to consult on your screenplays. So if you haven't used us before, please do. Operators are standing by. The COVID-19 series was begun in response to the pandemic in order to educate writers, put them in touch with experts. So we've been dealing with a range of issues. Our partners in these seminars have been the Writers Guild of America West here in LA and the Writers Guild of America East located in New York. And together, those are most of the working screenwriters and TV writers in the entertainment and news and documentary industries. Those seminars about COVID have dealt with issues like elders and caregivers and addiction and mental health, but we also wanted to deal with a health issue that is not quite as clinically focused, and that is the health of our democracy. And so our bodies are important, so is our body politic. And so this, the seventh in that series, is will our body politic, will our democracy survive this pandemic? And I can't think of a better group of participants and colleagues and panelists to be talking about that. I would like to introduce them to you, and here through the magic of Zoom, they are. Excellent. So I'm thrilled to introduce them very briefly to you. If you know them, you love them already, and if you don't, you're going to. So I'd like to welcome Stacey Abrams. She was the Georgia House Minority Leader. She was the Democratic gubernatorial candidate for governor in Georgia. She is the founder and chair of Fair Fight and Fair Fight Action that we're going to hear about tonight. Welcome. And Kathleen Hall Jamieson is at the sister school of mine at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, where she has been dean, is a professor, and started and runs the Annenberg Public Policy Center. She is also the author of 12.5 books at least. And it turns out, happy coincidence, that tomorrow is the paperback release of her book called Cyber War. And the subtitle will tell you, if you don't know the book, what we don't, can't, and do know about how Russian hacks and trolls helped elect President Donald Trump. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you.
And Norman Lear, who is the namesake of the Lear Center, both because of his work, which proves that entertainment can make a difference and be entertaining, and his amazing generosity and philanthropy to our work. Never tire of thanking him. He has produced, created, or developed more than 100 television shows, and it includes, for example, right now, the 4th season of his latest series, One Day at a Time, which is on Norman set that up because it's a cue when he's going to say something funny, but is it your daughter?
I have my oldest daughter, Ellen, calling me because I forgot to turn off the phone. I'm on a conference call, a major Zoom call with people around the country. I love you. I'll call you later.
Talk to you later.
And sign in and watch your father.
So that's a cue for me to ask you. So Norman has 6 children, and Norman, what is the age range of your children?
25-year-old twin daughters, and the telephone call was from my oldest, 73.
So that is a life. He
That is 6 sensational people.
And he also founded People for the American Way. I love telling this story. I asked Norman what he most wanted people to know about him that they didn't know. And I loved his answer, which is that he is a World War II veteran. Norman flew 54 bombing missions over Germany and Italy during the war. One bombing mission kind of boggles the mind. So thank you, Norman, for everything. Bill Moyers was going to join us. Turns out that he couldn't. I hope he'll be with us at a subsequent event. So what we're talking about is the state of democracy, of the body politic. And the COVID epidemic didn't make everything that we're going to talk about happen. Things have been challenging for our beloved American democracy for more than a month and more than even a few years. People have said that it's been falling short. Some people have said it was a basket case. But COVID-19 has magnified and exacerbated and illuminated so much of the fault lines and the issues. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I want to start by just jumping in on one tiny point and expanding out from it. And that has to do with face masks. And so, Norman, question for you. You created a character, Archie Bunker, in All in the Family, an immortal American type, a guy who speaks his mind and is rough around the edges, lovable, but has some strong and sometimes offensive to some people opinions, has even been called a bigot. And so my question to you, Norman, is if someone asked Archie Bunker, if it was someone in authority, to put a face mask on, what would he say? What would he have said? Would he do it?
I think he would have the problem. He would have as much of a problem as I'm having thinking about what the answer. I see the scene. I hear and see Edith asking him to wear the mask. I see him resisting and resenting, but ultimately wearing it.
And believing that there was a place for authority.
Yes.
Maybe just from Edith, if not the governor.
It's a great question, and it would take an episode.
Okay.
I see the ending of the episode would have the door opening and the audience not knowing whether they were going to see him exit with or without the face mask, and he would exit with it.
So I'm going to ask Stacey. May I call you Stacey?
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask you the kind of the same question, but in a different way. There was a story in yesterday's Wall Street Journal about a woman named Shaunti Wish Thompson, who works at a Kroger's store in Illinois, about 100 miles outside of Chicago. In Illinois, the story reads, an executive order by Governor J.B. Pritzker mandates masks in public when people can't maintain a distance from one another. And she said that one man refused her request, saying that he don a mask, saying he didn't vote for the governor. What should she say to him? What would you say to him?
That this is a question not of who is in charge, but who should live. Because fundamentally, that's the point of the masks. It's the point of all of the social distancing. It's the point of the decisions that are being made. We are talking about life or death. And we're talking about living in a nation where we are quickly approaching 100,000 people dying from disease, where we know that social distancing and masks can dramatically reduce the likelihood of a person losing their life. And that a small concession of ego, which is essentially what this is not a high price to pay to protect the life of that woman or of her children or of the grandparent that she is taking care of. That this is a matter of life or death, and that no one's ego or sense of self is going to be impugned by putting on a mask that will stop you from spitting on me.
Kathleen, I'm going to also ask you that question, but in a slightly different way. There were a number of demonstrations in state capitals around the country. In one particular week, they were in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Virginia. And people at the demonstrations were not wearing masks, not observing social distancing. And the President of the United States sent out 3 tweets, all in capital letters: liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia. What's happening in there? Can you unpack that moment so that we get an insight into this moment in American civic life?
But we've got an historic tension between safety and well-being of all and perceptions that you've got individual liberty and freedom coming into tension at a point at which what you do affects the well-being of others. And so ordinarily when we're talking about personal liberty and personal freedom, we're talking about something which if you do affects you, but it doesn't affect anybody else. But when you talk about whether you put a mask on or not, by virtue of putting the mask on, you're protecting other people, and other people wearing a mask are protecting you and your loved ones simultaneously. But what this reminds me of is moments in the past in which leaders have demonstrated effectively that we should engage in activity. The Queen of England vaccinated her children for polio in a very public way to assure the public when I was a child that vaccination was safe for parents, in that case, parents in Britain. But parents around the world got a signal that if leaders are doing it, it must be okay for their children. To the extent that people model behavior and others believe that they are appropriate role models, we increase the likelihood that we get good behavior that will affect everyone positively. And when someone, for example, takes hydroxychloroquine and suggests it might be okay for everybody else, I have no problem with someone taking those personal risks themselves. If a person wants to decide to take personal risk in consultation with a doctor, that's their decision. At the point at which that's modeled behavior and other people less likely to consult a physician, for example, or trying to find a physician who will be a pliable physician engaged in that behavior, they may be endangering their lives. Leadership matters because leadership models, not simply because leadership enacts policy.
And so when that president, unlike the Queen of England, is modeling behavior, not just taking that drug, but announcing to the world, liberate these states, what is that doing to our civic fabric?
It's confusing the hell out of it. I mean, I sit here at my age, utterly confused by whither goest our culture. I can't, I'd like to guess that he can't make it into a second term. And can't bring myself to that guess because I don't know that he can't. And I'm utterly confused.
So that's the segue to the larger question I was going to ask all three of you, the same question. You've half answered it there, Norman. When it comes to the health of our body politic, the health of our democracy, right now, what do you most fear? What keeps you awake? What most worries you?
Is that asking?
Yes. I'll start with you, Norman, yes.
Well, what worries me is what I indicated about a second term. I fear, I mean, 4 more years is just, but, you know, as I look at the screen and see Stacey, I have to say, in Stacey, among others, but she represents everything I care about and everything I think we need going forward. Her youth, her excitement, her interests, her values, her ability to bring us all together. I feel it so keenly. I have to mention it or I can't say another word.
So, Stacey, I'll ask you, what most troubles you? What do you most fear about what could be happening in our democracy right now?
I think we have to begin by understanding that our democracy has been challenged from its inception. This is a nation that has intentionally excluded voices from the very beginning. We reached a high watermark with the creation of the Voting Rights Act, which was the moment of entry for most communities that have been long excluded either by law or by practice. And in 2013, the decimation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, what that did was more than send the signal to the rest of America that we had a nation where the judiciary no longer cared about the existence of racism and discrimination and the hurdles that were being put in place. What they signaled was that it was a free-for-all, that power was going to trump people in the pursuit of what our nation would be. Where my deepest concern lies is that we can't see this as a single moment or see Trump as emblematic of in and of himself. He is a symptom of a larger problem. He is not the disease. And the extent to which we think that we have solved our problems if we win an election, we are not only sorely mistaken, but we are setting ourselves up for a deeper division. I think about this election in 2 ways. We have the 2020 election, which for many is a redo of 2016 and an attempt to reclaim at least the moral core of America by having leaders, especially in the White House, who are men, you know, in this case, it's going to be a man who is a man of conscience and a man of courage, but also of competence. but we're also running the 2010 election. And many of us remember the high water mark of 2008, the election of Barack Obama, the incredible actions that happened in that 2-year span. But what we forget is that because we thought of the election of a president as the solution to all problems, we did not do the work in 2010, which led to a reconstruction of our Congress that led to 10 years of decimation of our values, which is why Trump was able to become president. And so I want us to remember, my deep worry is that we think that there is a moment that will solve our problems. This is a mission, and it is going to require multiple steps, including voting up and down the ballot, but also making certain that we're participating in the census. And I'm happy to go into all of these details in a minute. But the bottom line is we have to recognize, to Mr. Lear's point, that we have the responsibility to think not only about today and our lives, but about what comes next, about how do we excite and engage. And that can only happen if people believe that there's possibility. People will check out of these conversations and they will cede power to those who will misuse it unless we convince them that it is worth fighting for. And that's why we have to have a broader construct than simply a single election solving our problems.
Thank you. Kathleen, same question to you. What most concerns or troubles you about the state of democracy and where it might be heading?
Democracy harnessed to Enlightenment values is what's gotten us to where we are. And to the extent that we now have an undermining of Enlightenment values, respect for science, the sense that we can come together and find rational grounds on which to deliberate. At the point at which you begin to challenge those assumptions, you make it very difficult for us to make good decisions. And in an environment in which our institutions are not as respected as they once were, and there are assaults on institutions, particularly in this moment, assaults on science as an institution, we are calling into question whether when science delivers the vaccine for us and the Food and Drug Administration certifies it as safe and effective, people are going to believe that the Food and Drug Administration is telling the truth. All right, scientific integrity has been undermined. Whether or not the science actually has delivered a safe vaccine or not, and whether it could tell us the truth about it if in fact it was or was not safe. So to the extent that science has now become politicized, we can't trust what we hear because the institutions that speak to us about science through the government have not been able to say the things that they would like to say. We're going to have trouble navigating our way out of this. And that at a time in which we also have the terrible health disparities that are the byproduct of a democratic structure that didn't work well for all, which means that there are parts of our society which are now more likely to contract COVID, more likely to be hospitalized, and more likely to die of COVID. The social determinants of health are real. Poverty, lack of access to insurance, comorbidity created because of lack of access to environments in which you could get fresh groceries at an affordable cost, for example, thereby fueling an obesity problem inside some communities simply because of lack of access for safe places that children can exercise. All of those things now have created vulnerabilities in our body politic and parts of our populations that mean that if we don't find ways to address the science well and reach these communities with the best available science aggressively through democratic institutions, they're not going to get the benefits of the science when we get the vaccine because they'll be under-vaccinated. And that would be a tragedy on top of a tragedy.
So I want to mention to those who are listening to this conversation that you can ask questions. And the way you do that is with the Q&A button on your screen if you're watching us on Zoom. So please feel free at any time, if something prompts you to ask a question, put it in there. And in a while, if we haven't answered it, we'll do our best to ask it and address it. I want to pick up on something you said there, Kathleen, about comorbidity, about the inequality of people's health going into this pandemic. One thread that you hear in talk radio and in regular conversations with other people is the idea that some people who are suffering, especially because of this, it's because they have made bad choices. that there is something in how they have lived their lives, which of course they are more vulnerable. The idea that of moral hazard, that people should not be exempt from the consequences of their bad decisions, as opposed to the notion that there are factors which are not of their choosing, and that we all together should say that everybody deserves to be healthy, that it is not something to be rationed or given out because you've behaved well or not. So I guess I want to put that in a question.
Because you chose to be born Black or gay or Hispanic or whatever. As if those...
I was going to turn to you, Norman, but I didn't know how well you would answer the question before I could figure out what to ask.
Well, based on what I've dealt with in storytelling and so forth, how could I avoid understanding that those things we have no choice about, that shouldn't be a factor at all, given that we are all, my bumper sticker reads, just another version of you. And that's who we are, versions of one another.
Stacey, do you hear this theme of deservingness as a way of dealing with what ought to be an issue of we're all in this together?
It's the crux of many of the political debates we see playing out across the country, because the structural inequities that Dr. Jameson very eloquent, or Dean Jameson very eloquently laid out, is that we live in a nation that has built itself upon historical inequities that, instead of solving for those challenges, we've tried to bury them beneath even more layers of inequity. Think about three things. One, the Navajo Nation now has the single highest incident rate of COVID-19 in the nation. The Navajo Nation covers Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Their challenge is the fact that the reservation system that the United States set up in response to our original sin here, or one of our original sins, that nation does not have the ability to respond effectively to a pandemic. And they were left without any of the access that they needed through the Indian Health Service that the United States agreed to provide. And they had no capacity to build their own tax base because of the structure that we have created in terms of their economy. But in response, in South Dakota, a different Native American community tried to protect themselves by limiting who could have access or egress. And the governor of South Dakota refused to allow them to protect themselves. If you live in Georgia, Georgia is a state that has 500,000 people who do not have access to health insurance because the governor has refused to expand Medicaid. There are 14 states that have refused to do so. 9 of them are in the South, and that is where you have the highest incident rates of these comorbidities, but it's also where you have the least likely coverage of health insurance. You have the lowest public benefits paid out. You have the lowest likelihood of having paid medical leave, and you have the highest likelihood of being in poverty. These things work in tandem. And in the state of Georgia, we have now refused billions of dollars that could solve this problem, which is why at one point in March, the city of Albany, Georgia, had the 4th highest COVID infection rate in the world. The third example I will give you is that we know that writ large, these inequities come about and get compounded by our failure to participate in the census. The census is how the United States allocates billions of dollars, and in fact, heading into 2021, $1.5 trillion per year. Those dollars pay for hospital beds, protective equipment, but they also address the structural inequities of food deserts. We have counties across the country that do not have the population base to have a grocery store, which means that when they get their EBT cards, they can only shop in a gas station or a liquor store. That then leads to, again, Dean Jameson can explain it even more eloquently, we create and then recreate each challenge And then we underinvest in the solutions. And because these are the same populations that face voter suppression, they have no voice in setting up the solutions and hiring through election those who will see them and serve them. And so the health of our democracy is always at risk, in part because the structural systems don't simply create inequities, they also create barriers to solution. And until we fracture both of those barriers and intentionally create opportunity and access, we're going to continue to have this conversation.
So Norman, this fourth season of One Day at a Time, the first episode had Ray Romano as a guest star playing a census taker,
Yes.
coming to the home of a Latinx family. Can you describe what the dilemmas and the kinds of issues and fights that they had about that?
Well, he came at a time when some distant relatives from another town were visiting. And they were the One Day at a Time cast. The family is a Democrat family, but their relatives were Republican. And they were having difficulty conversing and arguing about what, and then the census taker walked in on top of that. So they were covering both sides of the argument within the family structure.
And was the issue of whether disclosing anything to a census taker would ultimately get you in trouble? Was that on the table?
That was the essence of the discussion on both sides from individuals representing both points of view.
So in a way, the census has been weaponized in the current climate.
In that episode of that show, yes.
Well, and I would add, it's been weaponized very intentionally. We know that the census in 2020, until there was finally an action taken by Congress, was underfunded by more than $5 billion. We know that the citizenship question, although it was rebutted or rebuffed by the Supreme Court, there was an announcement by the Census Bureau that they were going to use block level data to provide citizenship information to states. And that was intentionally designed to strip communities, particularly communities of color, of their ability to be represented, because the way the census works, when redistricting happens, not at the congressional level, but at the state legislative level, at the school board level, at the county level, if you use citizen voting age population, it's going to sound way too esoteric, but here's the thing to remember. If you only use citizen age voting population, then what you can do is you can exclude, when you're counting who gets to be qualified to be represented by a political district, you can take out all of the children. You can take out anyone under 18. You can eliminate anyone who is not a citizen, meaning someone who's a resident, a green card holder, or undocumented. What you're left with then in the United States today is that 50% of the population under the age of 15 is communities of color. If you remove them from the calculation, then what that means is that you create a whiter and therefore more Republican voting base. And under the Constitution, if they are not counted as part of the population, you are not committing discrimination if you don't include them in the drawing of those lines, which means a school board that has a predominantly Latino population in Arizona, but a number of those kids are undocumented or their families are, they are now no longer able to elect anyone who represents them because of the way the lines are drawn. This weaponization is not only intentional, it is continuing. And part of what's happening in the HEROES Act, which just passed the House and is sitting in the Senate, is that it includes language that forbids the census from providing this data in circumvention of the Supreme Court. But that weaponization is ongoing, and that's my point about thinking about these things in moments as opposed to as a process. We have to be vigilant on every single level because they do not stop simply because they get blocked at one point of egress.
So Kathleen, you have been vigilant about American elections, and I saw a headline of a piece not just a few days ago, which said basically that Putin is in charge and he is going to figure out who will win the next election. So I'd love your take on the vulnerability of our system right now to not only Russian, but other bad actors.
But let me say something positive about the difference between where we are now and where we are in 2016. The secretaries of state are far more aware of election interference as a concern and have looked at it, and I think done it with integrity across the states, trying to ensure that we don't have actual vote tampering. Now, whether they're going to be successful or not is another question, but we're all hands on deck in a way there that we certainly weren't in 2016. Secondly, the platforms, the social media platforms, are now far more likely to recognize and to interdict what they call inauthentic presence on the internet. They're basically the people who are pretending to be someone that they are not. The St. Petersburg troll who's pretending to be my neighbor in Philadelphia. So to the extent that it is spotted early and taken down quickly, we are less vulnerable than we were. They also are posting up fact-checking content against deceptive content. And they're trying to downplay deceptive content. And in the case of deceptive content about COVID and earlier about measles, they're just simply stripping it off. It's not a matter of counteracting it. They're trying to take it down, make sure that it doesn't get to begin with. It doesn't mean that bad stuff doesn't still get through, but it means that the platforms are doing things that are important. And on YouTube, when you see content that's initiated through a foreign government, you now see a disclaimer on YouTube saying it's government funded. Now that means our PBS materials are getting a disclaimer, which I wish they would be able to say government funded. I wish we supported PBS so well that it could carry the full disclaimer on the bottom, but it says partially because we just don't give enough money to the government to earn the full disclaimer. But all of those things are giving us some protections we didn't have in 2016. And I think our press is going to be more vigilant should hacked content be dropped into the electorate, and less likely to use it as uncritically as it used it in 2016. So if Putin were to try to rerun 2016, I think those things would minimize the likelihood that he would have an effect. That doesn't mean there aren't other bad actors or there aren't other kinds of things that are highly problematic, but at least on those grounds, I am more optimistic than I would have been had I been able to see what was happening in real time in 2016.
So I want to get to the voting part of the election. Norman, I'm reminded that you purchased a copy of the Declaration of Independence struck on July 4th, 1776, and you used it with a road trip of the document and then a project called Declare Yourself, focused on voter registration.
Yes. And if I'm correct and remembering correctly, we registered 2 million young voters.
Right, with a focus on first-time voters.
Yes. I picked up a newspaper 2 days before that date and read that there was a copy, a Dunlap version, printed by a fellow by the name of John Dunlap, July 4th, 1776, down the street from where the Declaration was declared, written. And there were some 13 or so copies in the world, and one of them was available. And I don't know whether, I know that the day we bought it on the phone at auction, Christie's or Sotheby's, and there was one other bidder bidding us up, and we finally bought it from that single bidder. But I did it knowing that I would get great cooperation from corporate America to travel it across the country, and that's exactly what happened.
And when I asked you what would convince people who would not otherwise register to vote, who were part of the 100 million who were eligible but not voting, you said that you wanted them to understand something, which is I matter.
Yes. There was something about looking at that document, you know, wherever it traveled, and I was there at many cities around the country, Wherever it traveled, the lines were extensive and extraordinary. And people waited for an hour and a half, some of them, a lot of them, with small children, just to get their few seconds in front of that document, often with tears in their eyes and so forth, because they understood what it meant in terms of we are one.
So Stacey, Fair Fight has as one of its arms an effort to get people to register and to vote. How's that going?
So Fair Fight, we focus on the infrastructure of democracy and pushing back against voter suppression. And I think it's important for storytellers to understand what voter suppression means in the 21st century. It's not the guns and billy clubs and hoses of the 1950s and 60s. Today, there are three pieces. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you get access to a ballot? And does your ballot get counted? That registration and staying on the rolls piece is an impediment that is the initial block to participation, which is why this process was so important. We have millions of people who cannot register to vote, not because they're ineligible, but because the process has become so complex or so fraught with challenge that there is no way to do so. We know, for example, that people of color are twice as likely to register if they're registered by a third party. So let's say the League of Women Voters or a project in your community. Well, in Florida and Wisconsin and in Texas, as well as Tennessee, there have been laws put in place to criminalize or to penalize using third-party voter registration efforts because they know it increases participation. You also have states like Georgia and Florida and Ohio that purge voters. You make it through the labyrinth to get on the rolls, but they kick you off. And so the work we're doing in 18 states, covering more than 100 million voters, is trying to make certain that in each of those states, we have the support to help people traverse those rules. It's also the issue of, can you cast a ballot? That's where voter ID comes in. And there's this terrible meme that goes around every time voter ID comes up. You have to have an ID to buy a beer. The reality is the ID to buy a beer is easier than the ID for voting. And we have to understand that those are two separate sets of skills and separate sets of information. Voter ID laws have become more and more restrictive to filter out those who are poor, those who are young, those who are communities of color, because the more difficult it is to get the ID, the more likely it is you're not going to be able to actually cast a ballot. The same thing is true with the closure of polling places. Everyone watched in horror what happened in Texas, where people stood outside for 5 to 7 hours in the primary because they shut down more than 400 polling locations in predominantly Black and brown communities. And then, does your ballot count? That's what we saw happen in Wisconsin, that tragedy of forcing people to sacrifice their lives, possibly, to cast a ballot was because they were told that using absentee balloting was not going to be permitted for some voters. Because Wisconsin has a rule that says you have to have a signature or a witness to file your absentee ballot. Well, if you're sheltering in place and you're by yourself, as 600,000 Wisconsinites were, they literally could not meet the standards to cast their ballot. And it depends on the state, but those challenges exist. What Fair Fight does is we try to make sure people understand that while we live in a United States, every single state has a different set of rules. And that's what makes voting so complicated. And that's why it's so important that the legislation being pushed through the HEROES Act for the moment of COVID-19 creates a uniform system that says everyone has access to vote by mail, everyone can vote early if they need to, and everyone can vote in person. But we want to get as many people out of line as possible by making sure they get to vote by mail. And if we can do that through the work that Fair Fight is doing and dozens of other organizations, we can make voting safe in America in the era of COVID.
So what you said there about absentee ballots being universally available makes me want to show something, a clip. And it's also about how that act will fare in the Senate. And this is, I'm rolling the dice here because we're on Zoom, and to actually show a video, who knows? So if you'll all bear with me, if it doesn't work out, we'll just pull out of it. But if it does, I think you'll be glad. And I'll say a bit about it on the other side. But Leica, who is, and Melissa, could you roll that video or try?
I'm Carl Reiner.
I'm Rita Moreno.
George Takei here.
I'm Harry Belafonte.
This November, for many of us, it won't be safe to go to the polls.
I am almost 89 years old.
I'm 83 years old.
I'm 93 years old.
I'm 98 and 2 months old, and I don't want to have to choose between my right to vote
And my desire to live.
Luckily, there's a simple solution.
Voting by mail.
But to do that, we need Congress's help.
Although we're dying to vote, we'd much rather just vote and not die.
Congress needs to give states resources to expand absentee voting during the pandemic. Call Mitch McConnell and tell him older Americans shouldn't have to risk their health to vote.
Wow, that worked. So
Yes.
that ad was created by, you saw Carl Reiner, his son, Rob, who was, of course, Meathead in All in the Family. Rob and his wife, Michelle, made that video. And if you don't know that group, Defending Democracy Together, it's a group of Republicans, co-chaired by Bill Kristol and Mona Charen. And that's a recent ad of theirs, which has just appeared. It leads me to ask you a question, Kathleen. I was once, not long ago, expressing my fear that in this coming election, there are so many bad actors, including Putin, but many others, who have figured out how to penetrate the technical entrails of our voting system, that they would be able to make a certain number of ballots disappear or registrations disappear and cause just enough technical mischief in just enough states that we would not have a result, and that we would then have on our hands a horrible dilemma of what to do. And I asked you, did you think that this kind of skullduggery was possible? And you said to me, you're being much too complicated. All they have to do is take down the electrical grid on the East Coast for a couple of hours, and that would take care of it. So I want to ask you, do you think that our system is vulnerable to that?
I think our system is vulnerable to all sorts of problematic behavior. I think, however, we also have a whole lot of very vigilant people who are trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. And because our electoral structures are decentralized, we have a real strength. If you're going to try to tamper with our system, you basically have to tamper at fairly local levels. Now, the problem with the electrical grid is we've got a whole lot of balloting systems that are online and require, as a result, some kind of electricity. That's the problem with that scenario, which is why that's my real scare scenario. But for practical purposes, there are also all sorts of protective mechanisms that are in place to try to keep that grid up and running, because we want to make sure we've got power to our homes, et cetera. So I try, when I worry about those things, to also say, how much confidence do you have in all the really good people who are largely unsung, who go to work every day to make our system work and work well? A lot of them have to fail for this to be able to be, these kind of horrible scenarios to be able to play out. The complication is many of those people have trouble doing their jobs well when we're sheltering in place and we're very afraid, and are social distancing, afraid of being in contact with others. And so I'm worried that we've increased our vulnerability because the pandemic has minimized the likelihood that we can engage at the very, very high levels of vigilance that we ordinarily would be engaging under routine circumstances.
Stacey, a question for you. If you're successful, if all those who want to make absentee, no excuse ballots universally available, and if we have a flood of them being received by states who have never seen the likes of those numbers, I have seen reports and commissions and concerns that they will so overwhelm the system, some of which don't permit the opening of absentee ballots until election day, that there won't possibly be a result on election night itself, and that therefore, because our journalistic conventions require early calls and who's ahead and what states are in whose column, that the nightmare scenario is that some states are claimed by some candidates, and then in the subsequent days, it turns out that they don't have those states, and then the idea of a fair election itself has been called into question solely because of the success of this mechanism and our entertainment desire to have a finish on that night. Is that a concern you've heard or that worries you?
So I was with a group of folks. We are working to help amplify the conversation, not only of voter suppression, but voter expansion and voter protection. We met with the New York Times editorial board and the Washington Post editorial board. And that was part of our message, that we have to start inoculating people against the notion that we're going to have an answer by 11 p.m. on November 3rd. There is no universe in which that is going to happen. We have to understand, and this goes to the issue of how decentralized our system is. We have 50 states with 50 different systems. Every single state has the capacity for vote by mail, but every state does it differently. And we have to remember that we can get as many people out of line as we'd like through vote by mail, which will be between 50 and 70%, but there's still a large part of our population that's going to have to show up in person. Those who are disabled, those who have language barriers. If you are Native American and live on a reservation, voting in person is one of the few ways you have security and being able to cast your ballot. We have those who are homeless, those who've been displaced by COVID, and whose mail-in ballot can't follow them around because they're couch surfing or they're surfing, car surfing. We also have people who attempted to vote by mail but didn't complete the process and have to come in. And so we will absolutely have an overwhelming response, and it will be a response that is unlike anything we've seen. But it is also true that there will be litigation. We are seeing this play out right now. We know that for every moment where a success is made to expand access to the right to vote, there is a concomitant effort to limit access to the right to vote. And the Republicans have been very clear. So this is not me being partisan. It is a declared statement of theirs that they're going to try to restrict who has access to the vote. It is a declared intention by a number of groups to expand access because this election matters. And so our obligation is to let people know now, you're not going to have the answer. It's going to be a cliffhanger that takes a while. My election in 2018, which was the most public conversation about voter suppression, in part because of who my opponent was, given that he was running the election at the time voter suppression was happening, that election took 10 days to be called by the Associated Press. In Wisconsin, just a few weeks ago on April 15th, April 7th, when they had that election, it took 7 days to call that election. Because California does mostly vote by mail, and because Colorado has vote by mail as well as Oregon, it takes days to get that information in. And so we have to, as part of our COVID-19 preparation, we need to explain to America that in every single state that has had a challenge with vote by mail, either expanding it or people being upset about that expansion, or because the laws are so convoluted depending on where you live, there is going to be a lawsuit in almost every state that has made it more restrictive, or there's going to be a lawsuit in any state that has made it more expansive, and lawsuits take time. It is going to take probably a week to get the right answer. But what we have to want is the right answer for our democracy, not the quickest answer for our entertainment. And we can trust the system if we know that there is uniformity because of the guardrails that are in place by Congress, if we get the HEROES Act through, if we know that there is vast participation so that Americans believe that they had a chance to be heard, and if we know that there is transparency, that we are talking about what's at stake, how the process works, who it works for, who didn't get to participate, and what the outcome can look like. But we have to prepare ourselves, absolutely. This is not going to be done by 11 p.m. on November 3rd.
Marty, there is one scenario in which this is much less problematic. You worked in a blowout election. Now, from your standpoint, the blowout was on the wrong side. But when you have an overwhelming majority on one side, and we've had elections like that, in which one side is just, for practical purposes, just wiped out the map, Then if you've got problems in a limited number of places, if they're not significant enough to change the electoral college outcome, you don't have these problems. So my message to people who are worried, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, turn out your side in such great numbers that you overwhelm the other side by such a majority that this is not going to be a problem. And that the people on the other side, whether the Democrats or the Republicans, can say, we lost. It also solves other problems because it's close elections in which you have all this legal contesting. So all of the back end concerns about that. Now you still can have all sorts of problems. It's just the problems don't affect the outcome if you can get enough of a distance between the two candidates.
Correct.
Thank you. In case you don't know, I was Herbert Hoover's speechwriter, so that was what Kathleen was referring to about the blow.
Herbert Hoover. Oh my goodness.
For those of you who'd like a hint, Marty and I are both from Minnesota at some point, I believe.
Norman, by the way, I saw Carl Reiner say his age. So he's a few months older than you, isn't he?
He's 3 months older than I, yeah.
Three months older.
Turned 98.
And you'll turn 98 in
I will
July.
do that in July.
Right. I'm looking at the questions and want to get as many as we can in. And so these are not, most of them are not directed to anyone in particular. And so I'm going to suggest that we do it as jump balls. Only one person needs to answer a question. But if you want to also answer a question someone else has answered, by all means, go for it. So how can Biden run an effective campaign during this pandemic from his basement? What advice would you give him?
I'm gonna let you have that one, Kathleen.
I'm just your friendly local academic. I don't do political consulting.
But you are one of the premier experts on political communication. Have you ever seen a liability like this in a campaign before?
No, but I would like to see a different kind of campaign, not just in COVID land, but over the whole rest of the history of this country. I'd like to see equal access to the airwaves on Sunday nights, beginning at a certain point in the election. And since we're all at home right now, this wouldn't be a bad time to start it perhaps once a month. And then you go once a week once you get to September, October, and maybe twice a week when you get closer to the election, in which the nation just stops for the evening. And all the other programming stops, and we give the candidates each a half hour. We flip the order in which they present. They start with a coin for the first time, and then they rotate. And they can do anything they want with that half hour to tell us why they should be president of the United States. But we pre-specify some things that they have to cover a certain range of topics across this. And also, secondly, we reform our presidential debates so that the presidential debates are like the Super Bowl. I mean, the nation effectively stops for the Super Bowl. It doesn't stop for presidential debates the way it ought to. We need to teach the electorate by creating such compelling content in moments that matter so much, and this is one, that they will stop and pay enough attention to give the candidates comparable access, which to some extent helps neutralize the effects of money. It neutralizes the effects of the micro-targeted dirty trick campaign dark ads, because now both candidates are in a situation in which they can talk against and to each other in environments in which we're paying attention. And because they have ongoing access, the other candidate can come back and say, well, that just wasn't true. So you gain the advantage of a mass audience again if we could find a way to do this. If we could conventionalize that, then whether someone is campaigning from a basement or not doesn't really matter, because we've got enough access and enough attention that they're able to make their case.
I will add one quick thing. We also have to remember that this is an artificially truncated election cycle. Most of us have gotten used to these protracted runs on either side of the aisle, where it takes months and months running right up to the convention. And this is the first one in the last 20 years where it was terminated, when the election was basically decided in March, and the conventions aren't going to be until August. And so it feels more protracted and thus more uneven. But until there are conventions, we have to remember that those of us who pay very close attention to all of this are paying super close attention. But for the average voter, they do not care yet about campaigning. And so there is time to implement Kathleen's very brilliant suggestions, because we got a little bit of time before it really becomes a mano contest.
Next question. Trump is a master storyteller. How do we, I assume this person is not going to vote for Donald Trump, how do we refute the story he is telling? Is it with, I'll add, this is not in the question, can facts matter? Does it have to be a counter narrative? Norman, candidates often come to Hollywood and ask for help with their message. What would you say to Joe Biden or people running for the Senate, for example, against Mitch McConnell?
I would say to Biden, grab Stacey Abrams. I saw them together, as perhaps we all did, and it was great casting. And I thought about it this afternoon listening to Stacey. Every time she spoke, oh my goodness, how I want to see her running with him.
So looking at the questions, Stacey, there are several questions which I was going to ignore, but I don't now feel that I can. So let me just ask, who is Selena Montgomery?
Selena Montgomery is my alter ego who writes romantic suspense novels. I published my first novel when I was a third-year law student at Yale. At the exact same moment, I was publishing my treatise on the operational dissonance of the unrelated business income tax exemption. And they were both going to press around the same time. Google had just become a thing.
Did they switch the covers by mistake?
Well, we were trying to avoid that. So we decided that it would be unlikely that anyone was going to read a romance novel by Alan Greenspan. So I came up with a pseudonym for my romance writing so that I could continue to write and publish in tax policy for several more years, while people also got to read me, making people die and fall in love in Selena Montgomery's novels.
But not in that order.
Not in that order, correct.
Well, I plugged Kathleen's book in paperback. For those of you who don't know Selena Montgomery's oeuvre, I suggest you look. The covers are, let me just say, smoking.
Well, if I can add this, not only does Selena Montgomery publish, but since you gave me an opening, my publishers would kill me if I didn't say, actually I have a book coming out in early June on the issue of voter suppression and how we push through, how we help save our democracy. It's called Our Time Is Now, Power, Purpose, and the Fight for a Fair America. Available at your local bookstore or online.
That is the cover smoking.
It is.
Another question, do any of you imagine the possibility of social unrest around the time of the election? Norman, are you concerned about that?
Social unrest, I have the feeling I'm in the center of social unrest right now. This conversation reflects that. The question reflects that. I'm interested to know whether Kathleen and Stacey agree.
Yeah, I worry a lot about the tendencies underlying the politicization of the COVID situation in an environment in which the economy may not be doing particularly well in fall. I think we can go back to what we know happened during the Depression and think about all of the legitimate grievances of people. I mean, people who are hungry, people who didn't have jobs, et cetera. And take that as a construct and say, that kind of economic hardship creates kinds of social tensions and kinds of anxieties. Remember the Veterans March on Washington, for example, during that historical period. That those things are very real. Now imagine that you have our polarized politics on top of it, in the middle of an election, and you've got a health crisis. Am I worried that in those circumstances, we're going to have high levels of anxiety and a kind of tinderbox available for social unrest, not just simply in one area, but multiple kinds of areas, not simply addressing the federal government, but addressing governors around the United States. as policies that are necessary in order to maintain public health are conflicting with people's legitimate need to put food on the table for their family. Yes, I think it's a real concern. And I think it's an argument to try to minimize all of those problems to the extent that we possibly can, simply because it's the right thing to do. It's a humane thing to do, but also because it's the way to hold us together through these tough times. And I worry that we're still creating a world in which the rhetoric says we against they, rather than we're on all of this together. If we've ever been in an environment in my lifetime, and I'm an elderly woman, although normally I hope I will live to your age, but wow. For practical purposes, if people can't see that we're all in it together, when this virus is not a Republican or a Democrat, and is equally willing to take both down, I don't know what's going to bring us together. And the fact that it hasn't is worrisome to me.
Stacey, do you want to comment on that?
I would only say that if we can pass the HEROES Act, if we can unify for the first time our democracy in terms of how it actually operates across the 50 states, with the amplification and the education for people to understand that by voting, you get to set the terms of recovery. You get to set the terms of engagement. That cannot be done if we do not have active participation. I think that is one of the antidotes to this challenge. When people know that their voices will be heard, often that will help diffuse the concern that they're going to be left out of solutions. And so I share Kathleen's concern, but I do think that if we do our voting right, and let's be clear, there is bipartisan interest in expanding access to vote by mail, as was pointed out in that video. It is a bipartisan solution that if people believe that there is an answer on the other side of an activity, we can give them that activity in lieu of social unrest. That doesn't mean someone won't become so exacerbated by their anger that they won't take action, but we can mollify as many people as possible by giving them an avenue and a venue for offering their voice and telling them, here's the way to create solution.
So I have one last question we have time for, and this is one would be great to hear all three of you on. Norman, I'm going to ask you to answer it last because there's a special way I want to ask it of you. The question is, how do we make the importance of civics education a lifelong pursuit, not just only K-12? I guess I would add, is it even K-12? Kathleen, I know you have been very much involved in that area, working with civics educators around the country.
Yeah, if people are looking for high quality civics materials, go to the Civics Renewal Network. It's something we run through my policy center, but it has every group in the United States that produces nonpartisan, high quality, no cost materials. And for moms and dads who are at home trying to figure out what should we do for homeschooling this afternoon or for a break over summer, just walk across that site. You can find Library of Congress, you can find National Constitution Center, you can find Justice O'Connor's iCivics. We need to use the opportunity of teaching from home to take advantage of online resources like that in order to increase civics knowledge. Because when people don't understand that we have three branches, can't name them, don't know what they do, don't know why we have checks and balances, don't know what checks and balances are, don't understand the process by which we have a veto and what it's for, don't understand why we have an independent judiciary, and don't understand the limits of the power of the branches, they're more likely to say, when asked, if the Supreme Court issues a series of unpopular decisions, would it be okay to get rid of the court? And they're more likely to say, yes, it would. Does it matter that we have too low civics knowledge? Yes, it does. And when we're in fraught times, and we are now, in which the system is being stressed on multiple fronts, is more important now than ever that we understand how our system is supposed to work so we can increase the likelihood that it does in fact work that way, and work that way for all of us, not just some of us.
Stacey, you have during this conversation been in effect a civics educator. You have explained how some systems and structures work or don't work. What's your experience of the level of civic knowledge among the people you meet, and your experience of civics education or aspirations for it?
I would say that the level of education, as Kathleen pointed out, is woefully low. When we began our campaign for governor in 2018, we had canvassers who went out into community. But before they would talk about me, in fact, we did not allow them to mention my name. Their first pass at canvassing was to explain what the governor does. Because we knew that before any name came up, people needed to understand the role and responsibility. And it was transformative. People were suddenly understanding why they didn't have access to healthcare, why Medicaid didn't pass in the state of Georgia, why they didn't have a grocery store in their county. Those were conversations they did not have answers to because they did not have the basic civics education. There's also this extraordinary video by a young rapper named Yellow Pain that you can find on YouTube.
I know, it's great.
He very eloquently explains and expresses the deep ennui that we see from communities that have been excised from our body politic and from civic participation. And he takes that moment to explain not only what they see, but how they can have power. And fundamentally, civic education is about power. In a nation that is a democracy, the only real power a citizen has is the power of the vote. But if you don't understand what that power can do, like any terrible movie, Marvel or DC universe, whichever one you want to pick, when the hero doesn't know how to control their power, it goes awry and it causes challenge. But when you train and you learn and you understand, it transforms how we save ourselves, how we address those social determinants of health, how we make certain that our democracy works no matter who's in charge of our country, and how we ensure that voices can be heard, not only in the Capitol in DC, but in our communities every single day. So I'm a strong proponent of civics education, but that is also the responsibility of every person standing for office. We can't presume that people should vote for us because of our pretty face or not pretty face. It has to be because they understand what's in it for them and the power they have to set the future.
For those watching or listening, the Civics Renewal Network, the URL for that is in the chat if you want to go find out to use that link. Norman, the way I want to ask this of you is to prompt you to tell a story that I only half remember. When you were younger, you won a contest in which you had to write an essay about, was it what the Constitution meant to you?
Well, in recent years, that's become a play, a Broadway play with what the Constitution means to me. And it's a woman who wrote it. When I saw it, early after it opened, she was the star of it. She was the person who wrote the essay.
Right.
When I was graduating from a high school, 1944, the American Legion announced they would starting this contest, what the Constitution means to me, an essay contest that required the participant to speak for like 6 minutes and then take a piece of paper and talk for another 2 minutes, answering a question written on that piece of paper. That was the entire participant. I enlisted in that my senior year of high school. I won, I think it was the New England, either it was the regional or the New England competition. And had a year at Emerson College in Boston, which was the gift of gifts for me at that time, coming out of the Depression. I don't know if I answered your question.
You have indeed, and you have shown us that this has been a lifelong passion of yours, and we're just lucky to be the beneficiaries of it.
Oh, I want to go to the question of civics classes.
Yes.
I always thought that when I was a kid, there was a civics class. And I would have been a different person vis-a-vis my relationship with my America had I not taken a civics class.
Wow.
And was taught what the Constitution means to me and to everybody around me. So I couldn't wish, I'm all over the place because I can't let this end without saying I feel like a 15-year-old at my age, 97, to sit between these two glorious women and have listened to them this evening. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Stacey.
I echo that. I'm truly grateful. And the worst thing about Zoom and Facebook Live is that you cannot hear the thunderous applause coming from truly the hundreds and hundreds of homes where people have been watching. And I'm sure, just like Norman, they are in awe, maybe a little bit in love and rapt. And so thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Writers, I hope you got some inspiration and some learning for the stories you're going to tell. And next week, join us on Tuesday, same time, for reproductive rights in the age of COVID, and then the following Tuesday, national security in the age of COVID. As you sign off, there'll be a survey which will invite you to evaluate tonight. Help us do what we do in a way that helps you. That's if you're on Zoom. Thank you again. Thank you, panelists, so much. Good night.
Thank you, Marty Kaplan.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Norman.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Marty. Appreciate it. And thank you, Kathleen. I've learned a lot.
Thanks all. And thanks to Melissa and Leica and Kate and our whole team who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. Good night.
You two women and you four women. Anything you need from a 97-year-old, you got male. You got.